Dzień dobry Państwu. Weronika Gawińska-Brulikis.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Weronika Gawińska-Brulikis, Janusz Kurtyka Foundation. It's my honor to invite you as part of a project, Seeds of History, the Relay Race of Peace. Today we'll be talking about the second corps, former soldiers of General Anders. May I welcome today's guest, historian and museum expert Wojciech Markert from the University of Warsaw, specializing in the history of Polish military formations, 1918-47. His profession is combined with passion and academic research, with also presentation of the results through exhibitions and other works. He worked for the Military Bureau of Historical Research. He has been involved in the development of the Józef Piłsudski Museum in Sulejówek, currently works in the Solidarity Institute of Witold Pilecki. Lover and collector of books, he is also interested in the history of Warsaw and the northwestern marches of the former Republic of Poland. Good evening. Good evening. We have Paweł Kurtyka, who is the president of the Janusz Kurtyka Foundation and the moderator of the event. I'd like to welcome all who are listening to us. Welcome, Wojtek. Hello, Weronika. The Seeds of History 3.0, the Relay Race of Generations, is financed from the funds of the Chancellery of the President of the Council of Ministers. The media partners are Blog Press and British Post. May I now ask the president of Janusz Kurtyka Foundation, Mr. Paweł Kurtyka, to take the floor. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your presence here, for listening to us. Our meetings with history recently really concern fairly popular subjects that we've been learning about at school. We had Westerplatte. That was a recent event. Today it's the second corps, General Anders's soldiers, and of course the figure of their commander as well. Now, what is most interesting is the history that is outside the history course books. That's something more that we can delve into. After our education at school, many of us know what the Polish Second Corps was, what the effort of Polish military in the West was, and to tell us the truth, listening to this seminar today, this lecture, and then the dialogue with Wojciech Markert, we have probably come here for something more. For entering the fine detail, the probably backstage of those big events. I hope we'll be able to do this. Wojtek, thank you very much for accepting the invitation. Now, please, your speech, your presentation, and then we'll be asking about some fine detail and then delving into the subject of General Władysław Anders and his army. Thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity of discussing what I am passionate about. One of the subjects is General Anders and his soldiers. Many things connected to the subject. I have this short presentation. I'll now try to show it. And that's it. Polish Second Corps, who were General Anders's soldiers, who were his army. That's a subject that is linked to many other subjects. I'll try to meet the level of the bar. Paweł set it very high, so I'll try to use it and start from a tale about the general himself. He was a soldier of the Polish Second Corps too, its
ale obecnie też
commander, a
wieloma
fantastic figure,
legendami, mitami.
but also one
Nie,
that's encrusted in
nie,
many
nie, nie,
legends
nie
and
potrzebowałbym
myths.
dzisiaj zmierzyć się z nimi
I wouldn't be
wszystkimi
able to
i opowiadać pełną jego
stand up to
historię.
all those
Wystarczy powiedzieć, że jest
subjects,
to postać
to
na tyle
share all his
skomplikowana,
story.
że
Enough
tak
to say
naprawdę
that
do dziś
the
nie
figure is so
doczekała się
complex that even today
takiej pełnej biografii.
we don't know
Nie
his
znalazł się
full
dotychczas
biography.
historyk, który by się
There's
zmierzył
been
z tą
no
postacią.
historian who could stand up
W zeszłym
to
roku
this
ukazał
figure.
się wspaniały
Last year, there
artykuł w
was a
Instytucie Pamięci
fantastic
Narodowej, gdzie jest bardzo
article
dużo
published by
tutaj
the Institute of National
szczegółów.
Remembrance.
No ale jest to album, jest to
Well,
potężny wstęp
that's a photo book
opisujący
with a
życiowy wspaniały, ale to
powerful
wciąż nie jest
introduction
naukowo
describing the
udowodniona
general's
biografia.
life, but it's still
To
no
pokazuje skalę
scientific
postaci i
biography,
stopień
and it shows the
skomplikowania.
scale of that
Jest to postać,
personality
jest to
and its
postać
complexity.
legendarna.
He is a legendary
I
figure,
myślę, że trudność z
and
uchwyceniem
I
jej
believe that the
w
difficulty
książce
in
polega na tym, że
grasping
właśnie
someone
wokół
like
niej
that in
ognisko
a
się mnóstwo
book
innych historii. Znaczenie tej
is
postaci dla
because there are plenty of different stories
historii jest
around it. The
ogromne, ale potrzebne
significance of
są
that figure
emocje dla
for
osoby,
history is
którego to jest.
huge, but so are the
Mam nadzieję, że
emotions
prędzej
that
czy
have
później
gathered, that have developed around it. I hope
taka
that
praca
sooner or
powstanie.
later such a work will be
Będę kibicował, no ale tak jak
created.
mówię, do tej
I'll be
pory
its fan and supporter.
jedna zwarta praca, taka
So far,
ilości biografia generała jeszcze nie powstała.
we haven't got a
Tak, mamy
powerful
tutaj
meat and
obraz, gdzie
bones
taki
biography of the
wyidealizowany
general.
generał na
Well,
podstawie
this is
zdjęcia, ale
this
tutaj jest
painting
też
of a general idealized based on a
drugie
photo,
oblicze, które było
but
równie
this is
często
the other
przedstawiane.
face, which
Teraz
was
już może mniej
equally
znane,
often presented. Now it's
ale
probably less
Władysław Anders był
known.
też
Władysław Anders
symbolem
was
dla
also the
komunistycznej
symbol
propagandy,
for the communist
symbolem
propaganda,
no,
the
takiego
symbol
przerażenia i to, co
of
spróbowano wmawiać
threat.
polskiemu
And
społeczeństwu
the
tutaj
Polish
po wojnie w
society at large,
Polsce,
after the war, were
uosobienie
talked
całego zła,
into it that they
faszyzmu, no
were he
wszystkich
was the
możliwych zarzutów
personality of Nazism,
kierowanych
of
całymi polskimi siłami zbrojnymi
all
na
the
Zachodzie.
evil that was
Anders
assigned
i
to the
dla ludzi, i
Polish
dla polskiej
armed
emigracji,
forces in the West, for
i
the
dla polskiej
Polish
kultury, ale
emigres and
też
for the
dla
Polish
właśnie
culture,
władzy,
but
władz komunistów.
also for the
Jest
communist authorities.
symbolem całych
Anders
polskich sił
was
zbrojnych na
the
Zachodzie.
symbol of all Polish
Też tutaj
armed
taką
forces in the West.
anegdotę, fragment wspomnień
Let me quote an
Stanisława
anecdote.
Stasiaka. On to był jeden ze spadochroniarzy
It's a
z
memory of
Sawickiego.
Stanisław
On wrócił do
Stasiak,
Polski po wojnie
who returned to
i
Poland
był
after the war
przesłuchiwany przez
and who
służby. I
was
było spotkanie, czy był
interrogated
u
by
Andersa. On powiedział, nie, u
different
Andersa nie
services.
byłem. Aha,
Were
no
you
to
with
mnie
Anders? No,
puścili.
I wasn't. So they let him go.
Bo
And
rzeczywiście później on był zwalniany z pracy i tak dalej.
later
Był
he was
represjonowany, ale
released.
tak,
He
więc
was
tak było
experiencing
rozrośnięte
repressions,
w
but
myśleniu
it was
polskie
so
siły zbrojne na Zachodzie Anders.
strongly
No też
connected that
po
Polish
wojnie, w pierwszych
armed
latach
forces in
powojennych
the
nawet
West were
sprawą
made
marszałka
tantamount
armii.
with Anders because
No i stał się jej
Anders
przywódcą
was the leader
politycznym.
of that army. He was its political
Jest takich
leader,
przywódców, ale taki najbardziej
one of the
charakterystyczny, najbardziej
leaders, but
charyzmatyczny.
perhaps the most charismatic, the
Także
most uh,
to był jeden z powodów,
characteristic. That was one of the
dla którego został
reasons
pozbawiony obywatelstwa
why
właśnie
he
przez władze
was stripped of
komunistyczne razem z
Polish
grupą
citizenship by the communist
polskich wyższych
authorities,
cywilijnych oficerów.
together with more than 70 other
No i
officers.
osoby związane z Andersem były
And then the
bardzo,
people
bardzo
connected to
represjonowane. Tutaj takie
Anders
były
were badly repressed here.
najczęściej. Pierwsze to było sprawdzenie właśnie
Well,
od Andersa.
first was making sure whether somebody came from Anders. Yes,
No
no.
właśnie, kim był Anders?
Right. Who was he,
Anders
by the
na
way?
mapie
He
nazwisko
had
wskazuje
a
właśnie na
name that
niemieckie, no jest to
suggested
tutaj
a
kurlandzki,
German
pochodzenia kurlandzkiego.
origin
Co
from
ciekawe,
the
jego bracia również zostali
Kurland
oficerami.
region. His brothers were
Także rodzina,
also officers.
która się bardzo spolonizowała.
So the family were very strongly
Jego, z
Polonized,
racji wyborów
and
biznesowych jego ojca,
due to his father's
inicjał
business
powstał
choices. He lived in different places in Poland. He studied in Riga,
w armii carskiej.
and he started from the Tsarist army.
Być w czasie I wojny światowej
During the First
wspaniałym
World War, he
kawalerzystą.
proved to be a perfect cavalryman. He
Był bardzo
had
ceniony, miał
a
kilkukrotnie
lot
ranny, ale też
of
wielokrotnie odznaczony.
various merits. He was
Zyskał
repeatedly
bardzo dużo,
wounded, and
popularność,
he
to może za dużo
gained
powiedziane,
plenty of, well,
dobrą
popularity
opinię.
would be probably too much to say, but
Był cenionym oficerem.
very good opinion. He was
Później
really highly praised as an
polski
officer.
korpus
He went
polski
through the
w
Polish
Rosji.
First Corps in
Był
Russia.
w wojskach wielkopolskich
He was
skierowany
in
przez
the
Piłsudskiego, żeby pomóc powstańcom wielkopolskim.
Wielkopolska
No i później
army
walczył
sent to the
wojnie
uprising by
polsko-bolszewicy.
Piłsudski. Then he fought in the
No
Polish
właśnie,
Bolshevik
wspaniały
War
kawalerzysta, tutaj z
or Polish
1934
Soviet
roku,
War.
no,
This is a photo from 1934,
przede
steeplechase.
wszystkim
First of all, a
tak był
fantastic
podrażony przed
horse
wojną.
rider, cavalryman.
Ale
That's how they
miał w czasie wojny
saw
polsko-bolszewickiej
him
także
before the
ciekawy
war.
epizod.
During the Polish-Soviet War,
Moim zdaniem
he had
nigdy
that
nie widziałem
very
się z podobnym
interesting
niczym.
moment.
On
I've
był
never heard of
kawalerzystą,
a
był
similar
autor
feat
Virtuti Militari
that a
za
cavalry officer won a Virtuti Militari
no,
order
misję
for
lotniczą.
an airborne mission.
Prawdopodobnie po koleżeńsku
He
został zaproszony
probably
do
was
lotu,
invited as a friend to
kilkukrotnie co
fly
najmniej,
several
samolotem
times,
nad
definitely,
Polakami. No i akurat
and
szczęśliwie udało mu się rzucić bombą,
he
ręcznie wówczas się wyrzucało
was,
bomby,
well, at the time you still operated bombs manually. He destroyed a Bolshevik armored
To
car.
powstrzymało jakieś tam ataki.
This
No, coś
stopped some
niesamowitego.
kind of attack.
Myślę, że
Unbelievable.
ten obrazek
I think that
z jednej
this
strony na koniu, z
image,
drugiej strony
on
tutaj
the one
pokazuje
hand on a
jego
horse,
charakter. To był zagończy, to był
shows
kawalerzysta,
his
to był
character. He was a real
wspaniały
Ulan, he had his
jeździec,
gusto, he was a
fascynujący się
fantastic
armią,
rider, fascinated
znakomicie
with all
posługujący
the
się szablą. No
things
taki,
equine,
niektórzy go wręcz porównywali
using
z
the
takim
sword
Kmicem z
fantastically.
literatur.
Some would believe he was the
No
embodiment of
brawurowe
Kmici's from Polish
te różne
literature.
akcje miał
He was famous
zaczynając
for the
pracę
bravura
w
of
armii,
his
służył w armii
campaigns. He
carskiej,
started
ale w
those
czasie
while
wojny
still serving
polsko-bolszewickiej
in the Tsarist
wiele
army,
tych
but
jego
also later
zadzonów
during the
i
Polish
walk
Bolshevik
miały no taki
Wars.
spektakularny
They
wymiar.
were quite
Natomiast
spectacular.
to nie było tak, że no to był
But
tylko
it wasn't
taki,
so
można powiedzieć, że jeździec zabijaka.
he was just a
Natomiast
daredevil.
on był też wykształcony w
He was also
na
educated. He graduated from the University of Technology
ale
in
też skończył
Riga,
szkołę
but he also
wojenno-marynarstwa.
completed in
Był
Paris the
naczelnym oficerem szkoły.
Military Academy,
W 1926 roku doszło do przewrotu
École
narodowego.
Spéciale
Był
Militaire de
szefem
Saint-Cyr.
sztabu
Then he was
obrony
the
Warszawy, ale
head
po
of the
stronie
General Staff of
rządowej
Defense
walczył
of
przeciwko
Warsaw
Piłsudskiemu.
on the governmental side, so
Zasłużyła
he
jego
fought
karierze
against
przemijać,
Piłsudski, but it
co
didn't
później został
harm his career in
służebnej
any
zbroi
way.
kawalerii.
He became one of the commanders of cavalry brigades.
Ta kariera nie uległa wyhamowaniu.
That
On
career didn't
wykładał
slow
kawalerii,
down.
dowodził bardzo długo. Do
He
1939
was the
roku
commander of that
ruszył na
for a
wojnę na
long
czele
time
Nowogródzkiej Brygady
and
Kawalerii.
then went to war
To jego
at
dowodzenie
the
w
helm
1939
of
roku
the
bywa różnie
Novgorod
oceniane.
Cavalry Brigade.
Bywają krytyczne opinie co do
There are
jego
critical opinions
zrozumienia
about
i
his
zamysłu.
understanding,
Jego przełożony, że
about
on nie zrealizował
the fact that he didn't carry out at least twice
takich rozkazów i zamierzeń
some orders
przełożonych.
and intentions of his
Można to
superiors,
wytłumaczyć.
but you
Nie
can
staję się w roli
explain it.
adwokata generała Andersa,
I'm not trying to be here
ale
the
można to wytłumaczyć jednak chaosem, który
supporter, but that can probably be
dniach zapanował w polskiej armii,
explained by the chaos that
bo
the
na pewno nie było
Polish
powodowane
army
tchórzostwem.
succumbed to. It was
To
definitely
zupełnie
no
nie pasowało do
cowardice.
tej
No, this
postaci.
didn't fit that figure at all.
Zresztą jego grupa kawalerii, bo on najpierw dołożył
And
brygadą,
his
potem podporządkował
cavalry
dodatkowe jednostki.
group
dużym zgrupowaniem kawalerii, tu
W-
dowodził w rejonie
He was
Warszawy, później na
commanding a group of
Lubelszczyźnie.
cavalry, a large group of
Powodziła się
cavalry in
bardzo dobrze.
Lublin land, not far from Warsaw, and they were faring well. In 1939, he was wounded on 2 occasions, and the second time he was heavily wounded, and then he was taken prisoner of war by the Soviets, and that was his condition. He was at Łubianka, detained at Łubianka. Maybe he was not tortured, but he was ill-treated, brutally treated, and from his memoirs we know that sooner or later he would have died, but he didn't, because some changes took place. The Germans attacked the Soviet Union, and therefore the Western allies agreed with Moscow. As a result of it, also due to the Sikorski-Maysky agreement, a decision was taken to establish a Polish army in the Soviet Union.
I tutaj polska strona miała inne pomysły, ale to Rosjanie
Polish authorities had other ideas, but
Andersa.
the Russians indicated Anders.
I też fakt był taki, że po
The
prostu
fact was that
inni kandydaci,
other
którzy by mogli na to
candidates
stanowisko
for
pasować, po
that
prostu nie żyli, bo
post were
każdemu
simply
dowódcy Katyniu
dead
oni jeszcze
because
wtedy nie
they were
wiedziano.
killed in
Także
Katyń,
natychmiast
although
Anders, jak został dowódcą, to
it
ja
was
widzę
not
tą
a
grupę
known
Siedlców,
fact,
możesz tworzyć armię
known then,
bez
and as
oficerów.
soon as Anders was nominated commander, he started looking
natychmiast
for
nabrał
the
podejrzeń i
officers.
zaczął
He
zadawać
had
niezgodne
suspicions. He
pytania
started
władzom
asking
sowieckim.
uncomfortable questions to the Soviet authorities about the missing officers.
Tworząc tą armię,
As the army was being
tak
established,
naprawdę on sobie zdawał od samego początku
Anders
sprawę z tego, że to jest pewnego rodzaju misja ratunkowa wobec
realized that that was
Polaków,
a rescue mission for the Poles,
którzy znaleźli się na terenie Związku
who
Sowieckiego. Nawet nie tyle Polaków, co obywateli polskich.
were
Obywateli
in the
Rzeczypospolitej,
territory of the
w tych granicach
Soviet
sprzed
Union, but not the
1939
Poles per se,
sprzed
but
września 1939
but the
roku.
Polish
Natomiast
citizens
sam
who
przeżywszy traktowanie w
happened to be in the territory of the
więzieniu,
Soviet Union after
zdawał
1939.
sobie
He,
doskonale sprawę z
having
tego, jak
experienced
może
the Soviet
wyglądać
prison,
rzeczywistość
he
łagrów
knew
i że
how
ci
the
ludzie
reality
już
in the
zaczynają
camps
znajdować
could look
wielu
like.
z nich
He
na
knew that
skraju wycieńczenia,
many people were exhausted
zaczynają chorować,
in those
że
camps,
to
that
tak
spreads,
naprawdę jest kwestia
that
miesięcy,
diseases
kiedy
were
zaczynają
spreading, and it was a
wymierać.
matter
Tak
of
to
months for those people to start
rzeczywistość
dying.
łagrów, więc to był
That
taki
was the
ratunek.
reality of the
W
Soviet
związku z
camps.
tym,
Hence, he knew that
oprócz
that was
takiego
a
zadania
type of a rescue mission for the Polish citizens. Apart from the
formacji
purely military task of establishing
wojskowej,
an armed formation,
on
military
też od
formation,
razu zaczął tworzyć
he
struktury
immediately
przylejające do tej armii.
started
Znaczy, do tej armii byli
creating
przyjmowani absolutnie wszyscy,
ancillary
którzy zdołali
structures
dotrzeć do
for
tych
the army.
obozów
So anyone
no,
who
również
could
trochę
reach
nie
those camps
patrzono
where the
na
army was being
narodowość,
established,
na
they were not
czy to
actually
jest
looking
kobieta, czy
into the
dziecko. Starano
ethnic
się jak
origin, whether those were
najwięcej.
children or women. They were
Też do tej
simply
armii
trying to
przylepiło
recruit
się
as many people
szukało
as
tam ratunku
possible.
mnóstwo
Many
ludzi, którzy
people
nie
were
było szansy,
seeking
żeby
refuge in
włączyć
that
w szeregi
army because
armii.
many people were actually not
Tak
eligible
jak mówię,
for
na
the
różne sposoby
military service, but they were
wprowadzano do
still
armii.
being
Tworzono
drafted
jakieś
to this
oddziały
army in many
małoletnich,
different ways. For instance, there were some ancillary units. There was the ancillary
Chodziło o to,
women's
żeby
unit.
na
There was the
papierze jak
ancillary
najwięcej
children's
racji żywnościowych
formation and so on and
byłoby
so forth, so that
od władz sowieckich dostarczać
dietary
żywność, dlatego,
ratios
że
would be delivered
warunki,
to
gdzie
those people.
formowane były
Obviously, the
armia
conditions
były ciężkie, tam
for
ciężka zima,
the establishing such an army were quite difficult. The winter was harsh. The winter of
taka zima była ciężka,
1941 was a harsh winter, but actually that very winter saved the Soviet Union as it
No i dała
slowed
się bardzo we
down the
znaki
progress of
tutaj
the German
Polaków,
forces.
znaleźli w tych obozach.
That was also a harsh winter for the Poles who were detained in the camps. So that was quite a feat to create an army.
Bo
Under such circumstances, having no training cadre, having not enough officers, some officers were brought in from the Great Britain so as to reinforce the army, and they kept on looking for the officers, and the Soviets were saying that maybe they ran away. And Anders asked Stalin, where did they run away? And Stalin said, maybe to Manchuria. What's rubbish? It was just blatant rubbish, because in fact, those people were already in Midnoye, in Kharkiv and other places. They were already killed in the Katyn massacre. This is one of the pictures that shows the training. If you know anything about weapons and training, if you look at it, then this soldier that is training firing put the silencer in the wrong way on the barrel. It's ill-fitted, so complete lack of cadre, but also hunger, missing a military kit. But still, the army was being created. The military units were being established. Regardless of the level of disease, regardless of the military equipment and it being rather poor and scarce, still that was the only chance to survive. Then in 1942, when Stalin got the situation under better control and the Germans were slowed down, Stalin decided to get rid of that army. He couldn't do anything by force. After all, that was an allied army force that was established due to the pressures exerted by the United Kingdom and by the United States. So he started limiting dietary food ratios, and he was just looking for a way of getting rid of that army. Among the Poles, there were different opinions on what had to be done. Władysław Sikorski, the chief commander, believed that this army should stay at any rate in the territory of the Soviet Union, because from there they could run back to Poland the fastest. And his idea was that the army would go back to Poland so as to enter the territory of Poland together with the Red Army. Anders, as it seems, he knew Russia better and he had more concerns. Although also we need to take into consideration that there was already some information about Katyn and the missing officers. Therefore, he knew that it was important to get that army out before the Soviets changed their mind and started doing something horrible. He knew that the political balance was changing. That was just a matter of time. Therefore, he himself started thinking and preparing for leaving the Soviet Union. And this is what happened. In fact, the decision was not Polish. It was the British who agreed with Stalin that the army would leave the territory of the Soviet Union. Therefore, they decided to move the army to their British dominions in the Middle East, where they were fighting with the Germans, and there were some liberation movements between the Arab peoples in those territories. Therefore, the British needed the presence of the Polish army. It was beneficial for the British, and this is how the British were exercising their relations with Stalin. Therefore, the decision was taken using different routes, the Caspian route. These army units moved to Iraq. And this is the army was renamed into the Polish army in the east. The Polish armed forces in the east. Not all of those who had been recruited in the Soviet Union camps reached the Middle East. Many of them died. of exhaustion. Many people died of exhaustion, but also such pictures, such as this one, the three little boys in the helmets. It's not the army of Anders, those are the orphans who were taken out of those camps. And these children ended up all over the world, in Mexico, in India, in South Africa. Their guardians, many civilians were rescued together with the children. It is estimated that approximately more than 110,000 civilians left the Soviet Union together with the army of Anders. Some of them had to stay in other countries to recover. Right. Those who stayed with the army, they started forming a new modern army, because in the Soviet Union they formed some military units, and one division even received weaponry, but the military equipment was substandard, and the British equipment was much better than what was supplied to the troops in the Soviet Union. I do remember the memoirs of one of the soldiers who was saying that on the one hand, they were suffering of hunger. They kept thinking about food, and when in Iraq they received dietary supplies from the British, and there was a lot of food, and many people were overeating, so the medical services had to be vigilant. But that soldier, wrote that he received 3 different types of brushes to clean his boots, and they received the best possible kit, something they could not dream of when being in the Soviet Union. So undoubtedly these people could recover not only physically, but also mentally. Those people had been subjected to major trauma. Many of the volunteers from the Middle East eventually went to the UK, because the troops were suffering from the insufficient number of privates, and so people were recruited to paratroopers, to the Navy. People were also recruited to tank divisions, but most people went to the Air Force. There was major deficit of personnel in the Air Force. So many people moved to the United Kingdom, and they had to get back to healthy dietary habits and doing exercises. But one could see that those people had suffered a lot from trauma. But that could be seen also in the Middle East as well. For instance, some officers were moved to the Middle East from Great Britain, and they were called as people coming from heaven. So they were called lords. So those who were coming from Great Britain were called lords. There was this Carpathian Brigade, for instance, and the Carpathian Brigade was taking part in the battles in the desert, and still starting with 1940. They were called pharaohs. Those people who came from they were called by the name of the camps. So there were nicknames, and we could see that there were some tensions within the ranks of the army, but that was addressed fairly quickly. But still, there were some tensions. Thus, we may say that we had 3 major components of that army. That was a melting pot, and many different units were being formed. People were moved here and there. so as to be used accordingly. By the end of 1943, there were many, by the way, this army was already then in the Middle East. There were many training centers, but under the pressures exerted by the British, they formed the Second Corps, the typical combat corps, and Anders became a commander of the Second Corps.
That was the idea of the Polish Second Corps. Why did I tell that story? Just because quite often the tale is simplified and people speak of Anders' army. Really, there were two different armies, and then the corps. On top of that, well, I've tried to order all that. Late in 1943, the Polish Second Corps was created, and then it was transported to Italy. Some words also perhaps about the national composition of the Second Corps, because I said that Anders would embrace not only Poles, but also citizens of the Republic of Poland. The Second Republic was a multinational state, especially along its eastern marches, which were then taken over by the Soviet Union, and from where many people were deported, not only officers, but also civil servants. Actually, anyone who was not interesting for the new powers that be, or people who owned something. Sometimes it was a coincidence that decided. Many were Belarusians, Jews, and Ukrainians. There were many Jews in the eastern marches of Poland along the eastern border. They were, well, the research has been conducted. Professor Jerzy Grzybowski conducted it. He has some Polish roots, but generally he is Belarusian. He's lived in Warsaw for years now. He escaped from Belarus. He studied the history, the fate of the soldiers of Belarusian nationality. And there were huge numbers, really. And those people in that Belarusian diaspora played very important roles. They were the people who learned things and who had particular awareness. Same thing about the Ukrainians. I recall what Ms. Markel-Henken did. She studied the biographies of Maczek's soldiers, but she's a lady who lived in Belgium. Now she lives in Poland. Well, both sides, but she's Belgian. She was interested in the Polish and Ukrainian community that grew. And there was a powerful element of those Maczek soldiers called Maczkowscy, and they got there through this corps. So that element was also important, and Jews. Jews, here we can see several elements that are worth mentioning. Anders helped really to create the Israeli army, the beginnings of what is now the Israeli army. Its roots come from the Second Corps and the Polish army in the east, around 3,000. Well, there are different estimates. Some even speak of 3,500 soldiers of Jewish origin, Polish citizens before the war, deserted, many of them armed. Well, they just reached their place, the promised land, as the Second Corps and the Polish army in the east were in Iraq, then in Palestine and in Jerusalem, by the decision of General Anders, was to not to chase them in any way. If they didn't want to fight, then punishing them and forcing them, something that the British administration wanted, would make no sense. And really and truly, well, Polish authorities would turn a blind eye on that. It seems that the solution was very good because other behaviors in the UK, for example, caused conflicts, tensions, there were even rebellions. There was an episode that Jewish soldiers didn't want to fight. They asked English to be transferred. That didn't make sense. This diagnosis was probably very correct, that nothing would come of that if they didn't want to fight. But of course, it doesn't mean that all the Jews who made it to Palestine didn't make it to the Second Corps. Well, this is a very telling proof. The gravestones, the grave markers of Jewish soldiers of the Second Corps. Also, the volunteers who went to the UK also included soldiers of Jewish extraction. Well, obviously, let me return to it, well, who there were as, what kind of Poles were there, but there's one more soldier quite uncommon. He was not the only one like that in the Second Corps. Wojtek the bear, he was not the only animal, but he was the only animal that was also a soldier. He had his ID card and he was just one of the members, you know, to cheat the British administration. He was formerly a soldier of the Polish Second Corps. There's also this figure, he was very pleasant, so I quoted because it can seem strange from our point of view, but especially the older generation of Brits, if they know Polish armed forces in the West at all, they know that something like that happened. They may know about 303 Squadron and the names like Anders or Sosabowski. No, absolutely not. But Wojtek the Bear, there was a booklet for children that quoted Wojtek's experience. Well, he was known among the English. When Prince Charles visited Sikorski Institute in London, he said, "Oh, yes, yes, that's Wojtek the Bear." And he said, "I know it from my childhood," and so forth. So there is a particular dilemma because you need to consider such a symbol and to be really judicious in using it, because on the one hand, it's a very fine symbol and it can carry that Polish story about the Polish Corps and its soldiers, but there's also that fear that it goes too far, that we forget about the drama of what soldiers have gone through before and after serving in the Second Corps, because the further fate after the war was in many cases dramatic. They returned to Poland, they were repressed or stayed in the West, and they didn't have any means of sustenance. Well, I'm quite cautious quoting that figure so as not to trivialize the whole story to those anecdotes about the charges bearing bear. That would be just very comfortable. I mentioned the Carpathian Riflemen. And now some words on the Second Corps, on its people.
Dlatego, że tak jak wspominał Paweł, no, opisywanie
As
tego, co
Pavel
wchodzi
mentioned,
w Wikipedii, Państwo mogą
describing
sprawdzić,
the
nie wiem, szlak
things that you can
bojowy
check
drugiego
in
korpusu,
Wikipedia, like the
mogę
order of
tylko
battle
powiedzieć,
of
że
the
no,
Second Corps. All I can say
Witkowiec to
is
nie tylko
that
Monte Cassino.
the Second
Przede
Corps
wszystkim Monte
was
Cassino
more than
dlatego,
Monte Cassino.
że
It's primarily Monte
zaczynali
Cassino,
walkę
but
już jesienią
there was more than that. They
walką w
started
Apeninach
their order of battle in the Apennines in the autumn,
szturm na Monte Cassino i późniejsze walki.
storming Monte Cassino and
To tylko
fighting
początek.
on
Tak naprawdę
was just
najbardziej
the start.
spektakularną
The most
bitwą przeprowadzoną
spectacular
przez generała Andersa i
battle
jego
of
żołnierzy
General Anders and
to
his
wydaje mi się
army
wyzwolenie Ancony. To był
must
taki
have been
pościg
the liberation of
wzdłuż
Ancona.
wybrzeża po
That was a
przerwaniu tej
chase along the
linii
shore
obronnej pod Monte Cassino.
after
Później korpus został
breaking that
przerzucony
line
na
of
skraj
front by Monte Cassino. Then the
półwyspu,
corps
wzdłuż
went
wybrzeża
to
w stronę
the
Ancony
edge of the
uderzał. I to był
peninsula, and
właśnie rajd
it
w
was
stylu
attacking
Andersa,
along the
takich złotych czasów kawaleryjskich.
shore, and that was like in the golden days of
To między
cavalry,
innymi o
very
to chodziło,
Andersian.
żeby nie
And
pozwolić
that was precisely
Niemcom,
that,
którzy byli mistrzami w
not
organizowaniu
to
obrony. Oni
let
od
Germans organize
43
themselves,
roku
and they were
głównie się bronią.
champions in organizing
Zakończyć skok
themselves,
linijny
beginning
na
with
innych frontach. Byli
43. They
mistrzami
were
w
only
organizowaniu
defending
walk
themselves. They
obronnych
were really
i zadawaniu
masters of
kontruderzeń. Chodziło o to, żeby nie dać im się
counterattacks
czasu
and
pozbierać. I to
defense.
było
The
świetnie
idea was
przeprowadzone,
not to give them time to
świetnie
get
dowodzone, ale też świetnie
organized.
wykonane.
It was perfectly
Dlatego, że
commanded,
drugi
but also
korpus zdołał
perfectly
też
well
osiągnąć jedną
executed.
rzecz. No jednak było
The
trochę
Second
tego
Corps
czasu, ta
managed
zima
to
i
achieve
ten
one
etap
thing. There
wschodzi
was some
pozwolił
time, it was winter, and that
znakomicie
time
wyszkolić te
in the
żołnierzy.
Middle
Oni
East
jednak
made it
opanowali
possible
sprzęt,
to train those soldiers perfectly well. They mastered their
funkcjonowanie. No proszę
equipment,
sobie wyobrazić, jaki to musiał być
and just
postęp, że
imagine
od
what
czasu
progress
wyobraźcie
it
tego
must have
żołnierza, który
been
źle zakłada tłumik czy
if
karabin
from the
maszynowy,
time when you
on był ten
misapply
korpus
the
zmechanizowany,
dampener
posługujący się
onto the
najnowocześniejszym
machine gun.
wówczas
Well, they
uzbrojeniem,
were the
najlepszymi. Ja nie mówię,
mechanized
że te
corps. They
czołgi
had the
alianckie
most
były
modern weapons.
najlepsze.
I'm not
Nie,
saying
nie
that
będziemy
the
tutaj
Allied
się,
tanks were the
nie
best.
to jest tematem, tam
That's
porównywanie
not the subject. I mean,
konstrukcji.
comparing
Też
the
one były
construction.
nowoczesne.
No, they were modern.
Łączność, współdziałanie broni,
Uh,
lotnictwo, artyleria, to
all
wszystko
the
miało naprawdę
connections and all the
wyszkolenie i ci
communication between artillery
pokazali,
and
że potrafią, że to jest
the
nowoczesna, dobrze zorganizowana
Navy
jednostka,
and
świetnie
the
funkcjonująca.
airborne units that
To
proved
zresztą jest
that the
ważna pochodna
entire
dla
corps was
polskich sił zbrojnych, to
perfectly
właśnie ten
well
nacisk na
operating.
szkolenie.
Now, that
No to był
focus on
jeden ze
training
sposobów
was very
rozwiązania
typical
tej
of
żonglicy.
the
Tak
Polish
świadomość, że im
units. That
lepiej
was
będziemy
one of the ways
wyszkoleni,
of saving
tym
the
mniej
soldiers'
będzie zginęło, a
blood,
my jesteśmy
knowing
potrzebni,
that the
nas
better
trudno
trained we
zastąpić.
are, the fewer of
I
us will die, and then
polskie
telling
siły zbrojne
everyone
na
that
Zachodzie
we are
cechowało
perfectly
właśnie
well
to,
trained, that we're
ta
hardly
dążność do wyszkolenia, chęć
replaceable.
szkolenia się
So that eagerness
nauki.
to train,
I
to
do czasu
receive
zakończenia walki już
education
zaczynały być
until
przestoje i takie ten powiedzmy
the
może tak, w
end
czasie, w okresie
of the
walk
fighting, when
niezwykła
you were
dyscyplina.
still fighting,
Poza okresem
absolute
walk, no wiadomo,
discipline. Out
trzeba było
of the
reagować
battlefield,
na
well, you had
sukcesy,
to
że i alkohol
react
był
somehow.
produkowany
Well,
nawet
alcohol was
i
drunk and even
różne rzeczy się
produced.
działy, natomiast w czasie samych
Things were
walk to
happening, but
niezwykle
while
zdyscyplinowany żołnierz
fighting,
i
these
zarysował
soldiers were
korpus,
pure
to
discipline,
był
discipline
wyjątkowy
incarnate. The whole Second
dzielnie
Corps,
się bijący szlak.
they
Mógł
fought really
zakończyć
very bravely. Their order
pod
of battle
Bolognią
ended
w
near
1935
Bologna.
roku kapitulacją
In
armii
45,
Flan.
Germans
Bitwa pod Bolognią
capitulated,
też
but the
bardzo
Battle
piękna
of
karta.
Bologna was another beautiful
Niemniej
chapter
takim
in
najbardziej
their
znanym
story. However,
rozdziałem
the
jest
best known
szturm na
chapter
Monte Cassino.
is the
Bitwa nieco
attack on Monte
kontrowersyjna,
Cassino. The
dlatego
battle
że
was quite
zarzuca się
controversial,
Andersowi, że
as
podjął się zadania
Anders is
wysłania
charged that he sent
korpusu zmechanizowanego w
a
góry.
mechanized
Naraził go
corps
właśnie na
into the
straty. To,
mountains
czego
and
unikali
ran it
polscy
into
dowódcy. Nie
heavy
chcieli
losses,
wystrzelać
something
polskich
that
jednostek.
Polish
Ale to, że nie chcieli
command
wystrzelać polskich
avoided.
jednostek,
They
nie
didn't
znaczy,
want to
że nie chcieli
bleed the
się bić.
Polish
Oni nie
units.
chcieli
Doesn't mean that they
wykrwawiać
didn't want to
jednostek
fight. They
wojska.
didn't want to bleed
Działania
the
te są
army
nieskuteczne. Nieskuteczne
in
militarnie i
activities that were
politycznie.
military
Natomiast
and
uznał,
politically
że
inefficient. Anders believed that capturing Monte Cassino, that had not been captured by any other allies, would bring renown to the Polish soldiers, which would reinforce the political message, and that then it's worthwhile to fight. It's a Polish problem for the last 200 or 300 years, whether to fight or not. And of course, the traditional answer is that it depends. It depends on the conditions, what you can win and how much you can lose. So there was also a political calculation in that, and it was also something that was connected to the calculations. And Anders realized that the political profits are worth of death of a number of soldiers.
So, in fact, didn't take the ruins, but they were to address, to focus the attention of the Germans on themselves, so as to draw in the tie in the German troops. And when the defense line was broken in a different section, but Anders agreed to that. General Soskowski, the then commander, didn't ban that activity, but he was criticizing him that he was dreaming of the white feathers on his hat. But Anders was not dreaming of glory, although he liked showing as a leader. He was a man of good posture, but it was about the political gains. But he was not entirely right. Taking the Monte Cassino was a temporary famous event. Just days later, Rome was taken, and that was the first page event. And on the 6th of June, D-Day, the Allies landed in Normandy, and the Italian front disappeared from the mass media, and the public opinion was no longer thinking about Italy, the Italian front. So in that sense, he was somewhat wrong. But still, there is this mythology of the battle. This battle, after all, is known in the West. And at least in the Western mind, the Monte Cassino battle is known. I wouldn't say that it's world famous, but the participation of the Poles has been taken note of, positively note of. So who were the soldiers of the Second Corps? Those were the people who took Monte Cassino. So that was the general impression. But speaking about Monte Cassino, we could also speak about the social composition of the troops. During the battle was still raging. Monte Cassino was not taken yet. The cannons were still firing, but from the 17th to the 18th of May, that is a couple of hours before the Monte Cassino ruins were taken, Felix Konarski wrote a very famous song, The Red Poppies on Monte Cassino. He was a soldier and a poet in that corps. A refrain was his artistic nickname. Music was written by Alfred Sheets. He was an artist, musician of Jewish origin. He also was a soldier within the Second Corps. Just few weeks later, the scores and the text were published, as you can see. That's the cover of the first edition. And that is because in the Second Corps, just like in the Polish armed forces in the West, they had very well developed cultural and educational units. Those people, young people, needed training and education, and they also needed to have their dignity reinstituted, and that was done by music, by education. Many newspapers were being published. There were many prints, there were wonderful graphic designers who were working at that time. All of them had an opportunity to be engaged. That song became an unofficial anthem, probably the most famous anthem or the song of the Second Corps. It was performed by wonderful artists who were serving in the ranks. In 1946, that song was used in a movie. The movie was made in the Second Corps. It was about the combat way of the Second Corps. That movie was actually renewed a couple of years ago. And this is where we can hear the first performance of that song, Red Poppies on Monte Cassino. That movie was possible because Michał Waszyński, before the war, he was one of the more popular film producers, and he was also a soldier of the Second Corps. So we can mention many, many artists, painters. And well, I wouldn't say that Melchior Wańkowicz was a soldier, served as a soldier in the Corps, but he was a war correspondent after all. And once he returned back to Poland, he was telling about his stories on TV. And this is how the entire history of the Second Corps was rooted in the Polish culture. I have this impression that many times we do not even know, we here in Poland, we do not even know the history of the Second Corps or of the Anders army, and perhaps we don't know it from the schools, but we know better from movies and songs. The Red Poppies on Monte Cassino song is very popular. This is how we know about the Second Corps and Anders, from culture, from books, from music, less from school. But it is very important to revisit this topic and also to think about this fate of these people, the communists and the Soviets. Initially were trying to destroy all of that, but they failed. Anders and many of his soldiers didn't live long enough to see independent Poland in 1989. It's 1947. The armed forces were disbanded in the West. He then said that the day will come when the Polish flag standard will return back to Poland, as he spoke to the veterans from the entire world. I remember there was also a meeting. Later on, there was a meeting of the veterans of the armed forces from all over the world. I attended that meeting as a teenager, and I remember those people. Those people actually didn't really remember Poland because they were taken away from Poland as children from such places as towns around Lwów, or they were taken out from Poland from many different towns and places that were no longer in Poland. I remember I spoke once to a lady veteran who she passed away, but at that time she lived in London, and I asked her if she would like to visit Poland, and she said, no, my Poland no longer exists. I think she was born in the territory of the today's Ukraine. She was born not far from the today's Lviv. And as you can see, these people shared really dramatic fate. Many people left Poland forever, but many returned back to Poland. There is one more group of soldiers I would like to speak about. Those are the soldiers of the Second Corps. Many times they're forgotten.
Otóż są to żołnierze,
Those are the soldiers
którzy
who
byli żołnierzami Wehrmachtu.
were
Dostali się do niewoli,
Wehrmacht
wprowadzili się
soldiers.
do
They were
niewoli.
taken prisoners of
To
war.
byli Polacy, którzy
Those were
pochodzili z
Poles who were
terenów, które zostały włączone bezpośrednio
born
do
in
Rzeszy.
the
No, czyli
territories
Pomorze,
that we
Śląsk,
annexed by
no
the
i
Reich.
znaczna
That is
część Wielkopolski.
from Pomerania, from Silesia, from Wielkopolska.
Więc oni byli traktowani jako
They
obywatele
were
III Rzeszy. W
treated
związku z
as
tym byli
the citizens of
mobilizowani,
the Third Reich.
trafiali do
Therefore, they were
przymusowej służby
mobilized and they were
wojskowej.
forced
Później
to serve
dostawali się
in
do
Wehrmacht.
niewoli.
Then they
No
were
i to
taken
był
prisoners of war.
w sumie łakomy kąsek dla polskich sił zbrojnych,
That
bo
was
stanowiło uzupełnić
quite
szeregi,
an
a dla tych
important
żołnierzy, którzy tam
component for the
znaleźli,
Polish armed forces
był
to
to
reinforce
droga
their ranks.
dogadywania
And
się z bardzo
for those former
nieciekawą
Wehrmacht soldiers,
sytuacją.
that
Otóż
was a way
dość
out of a very
że
uncomfortable
bardzo
situation.
często
Many
trafiono do
times,
obozów
as they
niemieckich
were
wraz ze
being
swoimi
taken as
niemieckimi
prisoners of war
towarzyszami
together with
broni,
their
byli tam
German
potwornie
brothers in arms,
traktowani przez tych
they were
Niemców.
treated brutally
Zwłaszcza
by the
już
Germans
w
themselves,
okresie, kiedy zgłosili akces albo
especially
ogłosili swoje obywatelstwo,
after
starają się na przeniesienie. No to było
they
formą
had
naprawdę
applied for
bici
moving
itd.
to the armed forces of the Alliance. They were
To
brutally
były
treated and beaten by the German soldiers. So that was quite
Z
a dramatic
kolei
choice to be made.
często jakiś
Also,
tam Jankesi, którzy
the
gubili się w
Yankees,
realiach europejskich,
who were really at a
pilnowali tych
loss in
obozów
European
niemieckich,
realities, and they were
nie bawili się w
guarding
subtelności
the
swoich pola w niemieckim
camps.
mundurze.
They were not actually
I
seeing any
też
difference.
nie
They
traktowali
didn't know whether
Polaków
those
dobrze.
Poles in German uniforms,
Więc
they
to była jakaś
also
tam
didn't treat Poles well. Therefore,
sposób, żeby się wyrwać.
for them, it was a way of getting out of those camps.
Do drugiego korpusu też trafiło
The second
mnóstwo
corps
ludzi, tak zwanych blipisów
received
z Europy Zachodniej, czyli
many
ludzi, którzy
people
zostawili
from
na roboty
Western Europe
przymusowe,
who were
uciekli
taken
z
as forced laborers to
byli byłymi więźniami po
Germany.
wyzwoleniu
They were former
obozów
prisoners, and after the
koncentracyjnych
liberation of
itd.
concentration
Drugi korpus,
camps, they
łatwiej się tam
moved
było
to
też
the
mogło
second
dostać do
corps. It
Włoch i
was
do Wielkiej Brytanii.
actually it was easier to
Do
get
dziś
to
tak
Italy
jest.
than to the United Kingdom. It's still the case today. Anyway,
no znowuż, to była taka mała Polska.
and again,
Ta Polska
that
wędrująca. Ona
was
wędrowała
little
tam jak
Poland
bardzo
on
długo
the
do
move.
Azji Centralnej.
Poland,
Zawędrowała do
that
Włoch
Polish army was
i
moving
stała
across
się,
the
ten
Middle
drugi
East
korpus
to Italy.
przytulał
So
bardzo
that second
różne
corps was
osoby,
receiving many
życiorysy
different people. I know
uczestniczek Powstania
alive
Warszawskiego, które
stories
bardzo
of
pokrętnie
many
przez obozy
participants of the Warsaw
koncentracyjne trafiały do tego
Rising
korpusu i stawały się
who
żołnierzami.
could find
Także
their
w
way to the
efekcie
second corps through the
drugi korpus, który
concentration camps,
w
and
momencie
somehow they
formowania
were
miał około
capable of
30
getting
000
into the
żołnierzy,
second corps. That corps initially
w
had
momencie, kiedy
the force
zaczęto
of
go
30,000
rozformowywać w
when it was
1946,
being
miało ponad 100
disbanded in
000 żołnierzy.
1946. The
No i
second
bardzo,
corps
bardzo
had more than
wielu. To też jest
100,000
element
people in its
tej
ranks,
legendy, tej
and
historii.
those were people of all
I też jeszcze
walks of
jedną rzecz
life.
chciałem zwrócić uwagę.
There is yet one more point that I
Część
would
tych
like
ludzi
to
w
address
ramach
your attention to.
repatriacji
Some of
wróciła
those
do
people
Polski.
within the framework of
Różnie
repatriation moved back to
bywało,
Poland.
zwłaszcza w początkowych latach byli bardzo
Especially
represjonowani.
in the initial period,
Więcej,
many of those
część z tych
people were
żołnierzy
subjected to
wróciła
repressions. Some of those soldiers returned back
częściowo
to
z własnej
Poland,
woli, a częściowo wbrew
and
własnej woli.
some of them
To znalazła
returned.
się w Związku Sowieckim.
Some of
I
them
tam
went to
doświadczyli
the
powtórnie
Soviet
represji.
Union, according to their own will or against their
Ukazała
own
się
will, and there they were subjected
książka
to
do
repressions
Muzeum
yet
II
again.
Wojny Światowej. Wydała
There
się
is
na ten
a
temat.
book published about that.
Jak represjonowani byli
That
żołnierze
is a book
Andersa
about
w
repressions
Związku Sowieckim.
against the soldiers of the Anders army and
To
the
warto
repressions they were
zwrócić
subjected to in
uwagę.
the
Ja
Soviet
na
Union
pewno
upon their
książek
return.
ciekawych spojrzeń, to jeszcze chciałem wspomnieć
I
o
also would like
książce
to
też
mention
w tym
the
roku
book,
nagrodzonej,
that was
jednej
received
z
an
wyróżnionych
award
książek historycznych
this
roku.
year. This is one of
Bartłomieja
the
Mieszczaka,
best
wydane
historic
przez
books by
IPN,
Bartłomiej Mieszczak,
o
published by the
Oriencie ze
IPN,
Słańców. I
about
to jest
called The
opowieść
Orient ze
taka
Słańców. That is
popularno-naukowa książka,
that
ale
is a
warto na
popular
to
scientific
trochę inaczej spojrzeć.
book
Tam trochę
of those
pokazuje
who were in
nieco
exile.
inaczej
This book
tą
shows somewhat
historię,
differently
a
this
mianowicie
history.
jak ci ludzie, bardzo
This
często
book
nazwijmy
shows how
Kołomyi, czy
these
gdzieś tam
people
z
from
jakichś biednych
Kołomyja or
miasteczek
from some
kresowych, nagle
poor
trafili do
towns
Orientu,
in
do Indii,
the eastern part, all of a sudden, of Poland, all of a sudden
świata
get to the Middle
Arabów
East, they
kolorowego
go to the
i
colorful
tak dalej. Jakie
world
na nich to
of
robiło
Arab
wrażenie, jaki tam wpływ ta
countries.
kultura,
They were
również
very
coś
much impressed and how they were influenced by the Orient culture.
zostawało. I na koniec chciałem powiedzieć, że
To
część,
conclude,
duża
I
część
would like to say that
żołnierzy drugiego
very
korpusu została na
many
cmentarzach,
soldiers of the Second Corps
bo tak jak to jest napisane na
fell, and now
symbolze i w pieśni jest to,
they
że
are
wolność
resting in peace in
czasami się
cemeteries. As the
mierzy w
song
liczby.
goes, that freedom is
Tutaj
measured
cmentarz
in the
wojenny
number
na
of
Monte
crosses.
Cassino i grób
This is the
generała
Monte
Persa, jak
Cassino
tutaj
Cemetery.
w grobie.
John Paul II
Doskonale
paying
wszystko
tribute
wskazuje.
to General Anders' tomb.
Jan Paweł II miał wyczucie tych
John
symboli
Paul
narodowych
II had
i
the
umiał
great sense
się
of
do tego
national symbols.
odwoływać,
He knew how
jak ważna
to
to jest
make references to such symbols.
polskiego
He knew how
narodu.
that
Także dla niego
symbol
też to był
was
bardzo
important
czytelny
for the
symbol.
Polish people, and
Anders,
for
drugi
him
korpus,
that was a very important
odwiedzając
symbol, Anders and the Second
narodowy
Corps.
las.
By paying
I
visit to his tomb, he
ja mam nadzieję,
demonstrated that, and I do
że
hope
i naszej fundacji uda się tam
that
dotrzeć.
our foundation
Były,
will
mieliśmy takie
also
pomysły, żeby dotrzeć na
make
Monte
it there,
Cassino,
because
byśmy
we had an idea of
pochodzili przez
traveling
stołeczną
to Monte Cassino with some
historyczną,
historical
żeby to zobaczyć.
um,
Myślę
To
sobie
see it
na
all.
koniec,
trail
że
to
bo
see
jest
that.
to
And to conclude,
wciąż czytelny i ważny dla nas
Closing, I think that
dla
this
naszej kultury
is
i dla naszej
still a
historii symbol i musimy
symbol
robić,
legible for our
starać
culture
się,
and
by on
history,
był też
and
czytelny dla
we
innych
must
nacji,
make sure that it's
Jest coraz
still
lepiej.
legible
Na Kubie
for
jest
our
coraz lepiej, coraz
nations
więcej
and
jest wiedzy
for
na
our
ten temat.
cultures. There is more and more
No ja to
knowledge
zachęcająco się
of
wracam,
that,
więc
but this is real
mam
work
nadzieję,
to be done. So
że będzie
I hope
przynosiła
that
owoce.
it
No
will bear fruition.
i
And
na tym ja bym
well,
zakończył tą
this
taką
is where I
nadzieję.
suggest I
Bardzo
could
serdecznie
end
dziękuję, że
with
mogłem
a
trochę
message of hope.
poopowiadać o tym
Thank you very much for
fascynującym
being
temacie. Dla mnie
able
przynajmniej.
Jeszcze
of
bym chciał
talking
cię
about
o
this
parę
fascinating
rzeczy
subject.
dopytać,
I'd like to ask
żebyśmy
you some
poeksplorowali
questions so that
to
we could
nieco
Jasne,
explore
innych
spróbuję.
this. Well, I'll
perspektyw.
try. I'll try.
Tak, spróbujmy
Let's
jeszcze chwilę
explore it from some other
poświęcić
perspectives.
tematowi.
Let's devote
Z
some more
perspektywy
time to the
Fundacji
subject.
imienia
From the
Janusza Kurtyki,
perspective
która
of
zajmuje się
Janusz
promocją
Kurtyka
polskiej historii na
Foundation, which
świecie przede
promotes
wszystkim, to
Polish
jest
history
taki
all
nasz
around
tor
the
działania,
world,
no to
that's the
nasuwa się
core of
od
our
razu
activity.
pierwsze pytanie odnośnie się
We
do
have now the first
skazywalności
question
skojarzeń
about
tematu
the
Andersa
association
właśnie wśród
with
zachodniej
Anders
opinii publicznej. Tutaj
among
był
the
taki
Western
wątek, który
public
poruszyłeś
opinion and
dotyczący tego
how
bicia wojska
recognizable that is.
powtarzalnego, tak
You've mentioned that
rozpoznawalny dla części
there,
Brytyjczyków
Wojtek
z
the
uwagi
Bear,
na
who was
jakieś
so
tam dziecinne czytanki
very recognizable thanks
czy
to childhood
inną literaturę.
readings or
No ale
some
jak to
other
właściwie
literature. But
dzisiaj
tell
jest już
me,
tak z
what is it
obrazka,
like
może nawet nie tyle
today?
popkulturowego, tylko
Perhaps not that
zacznijmy
pop
od takiego
cultural
właśnie
picture,
obrazka
but let's start
profesjonalnego, czyli
with that
środowisko historycznych
professional one, the
badaczy, ludzi,
historians,
którzy się tym zajmują. To
researchers,
jedna warstwa, a
people who
druga
deal
warstwa to
with
właśnie
it. That's one
społeczeństwo.
layer, and
Czy,
the
czy
other
jakby
layer,
ten
let
cel
be the community
Andersa,
as
on
large.
został osiągnięty
This
poniekąd
purpose of
w
Anders,
sensie
did
tym
he
propagandowym,
achieve
oczywiście
it? This
przy założeniu
propagandist
tego, co
one, of course,
powiedziałeś, że
following what
politycznie nie miał to
you
żadnego
said
znaczenia
about
z uwagi na
circumstances,
dalsze
that
postępy na
politically
froncie,
it
prawda, Żyd i
didn't
tak dalej,
have
ale
any
więc to wiemy, że
importance
politycznie
because
nie grał tej roli,
Roman,
ale
all
czy
that,
chociaż
yes, we know
tak
politically
na
it
zasadzie
didn't
rozpoznawalności,
play a greater role.
wizualności
But
polskiego
speaking
wojska,
of the
czy to się jakoś szerzej przebiło,
recognition
czy
of the
tylko to
Polish
jest dla nas
army and its
Polaków tylko
capacity,
taki
did it
znany element
manage
naszej
to
historii
get
II wojny
through,
światowej,
or
a reszta
is it only an
mało co
element of
wie.
the Second World War that we Poles know and hardly anyone
Powiemy w
else
ten sposób,
knows anything
że jest
about it?
bardzo różnie i
Well, let
bardzo
me go
różnie
like
było w różnym
this.
czasie. Znaczy,
It's
myśmy też
different,
sami
and things were
troszkę
different
tutaj zawalili
at different
sprawę,
moments in
bo
time.
trzeba jednak
We
trochę
botched
cieni
this a bit because
dołożyć
you need
do
to put
dziejów, do
some
postaci Andersa.
shadows
On był jednak uwikłany w
on the
różne
figure of
konflikty
Anders.
w
He was
Polonii, w emigracji.
also entangled
I
into
to
different
rozbicie
conflicts
polityczne
with
emigracji
Polonia, with
lat
the
60.,
Polish
70., konflikt z prezydentem
diaspora,
Zalewskim i tak
conflict
dalej, i tak
with
dalej,
President
nie
Zaleski, and
ułatwiały,
all
nie
these.
ułatwiały. My,
These certainly did
Polska
not
emigracyjna
help.
tutaj też ma
The
swoje
emigrate Poland
odpowiedzialność, to co
really
zostawiała Polska
had
komunistyczna,
its
zawydając
own
własnego bohatera.
problems. I'm of
Na to był
course
czas,
sidestepping all the
kiedy
issues
trzeba było
of
tłuc.
communist
Jeszcze się
Poland
ludzie
that
żyli.
tried
Łatwo
to
żyją
revile
bohaterowie,
its
łatwo,
own hero.
prawda?
But you know, as
Natomiast
long as the
ten
heroes
czas
are
był
alive,
dla Polski
things can be
niekorzystny.
done. That was a
Trochę
badly
mogła się wygrać
negative
wojna,
time
ale
for
ona,
Poland.
Polacy byli
Cold War
wyciągani
helped,
propagandowo
but
tam
Poles were
jak
only
zależnie od
drawn
potrzeby. Jak
for
trzeba było ocieplić
propagandist
ze Związkiem
needs. You
Sowieckim, to trochę
needed
tak chowano
warmer
pod dachem i
relations
tak dalej.
with
Zresztą
the
trzeba
Soviet
powiedzieć, że
Union.
jeszcze jedną
Poles
rzecz.
were hidden, were
Tutaj
put away.
Władysław
One more
Anders
thing. Władysław
był
Anders was
nieustającym bojownikiem naprawdę
incessantly a
o
fighter
zbrodni katyńskiej. On
for disclosure of the cutting
ukazał się
crime, and
wielokrotnie
he
znawiana, przemycana w postaci
repeatedly
buły zbrodnia
uh,
katyńska w świetle faktów i w świetle
emphasized
dokumentów. I
the
on napisał tam wstęp.
documentation on cutting
I
crime. He
no, był
wrote
takim
an introduction
osobą,
to
która
this
gorąco go za
booklet
tym
that
opowiadał i
became
pokazał,
most
że mu się to nie udało.
famous about it. He didn't
Katyń do
manage
dzisiaj jest jakąś
really.
taką
Cutting even today
historią,
is a story where
gdzie no, nie udaje, wciąż nie udaje się osiągnąć
we
tego, żeby to była
still
rozpoznawalna, czytelna zbrodnia, co
don't
potrafił zrobić Związek
manage
Sowiecki,
to
żeby to było
portray it
czytelne
as
jak
a
Auschwitz
legible crime,
niemiecki.
as
No,
legible as
to
German
się jeszcze nie
Auschwitz, a
udało.
crime by the
I teraz
Soviet
tak,
Union. So
jeśli
this
chodzi o
hasn't
historyków,
succeeded
zwłaszcza
yet.
historyków wojskowości, to
Speaking
ta
about
historia jest dość
historians,
dobrze znana i
especially
dość
historians
poprawnie
of
opisywana w
military
literaturze
affairs, it's fairly
zachodniej.
well known, and
Dość
Western
nieźle też w
literature
niemieckiej. To
describes
znaczy,
it fairly
Niemcy
well, so
zauważają,
does
że tam był
German.
taki korpus,
Germans
który
note that there
walczył. Nie
was this
zauważają oczywiście
corps that
prestiżu swoim,
fought.
bo tam walczyła
They
elitarna dywizja
see it that
spadochronowa
they had this elitist
systemie
paratrooper
zna.
division, and
Historycy
that's
wojskowości, tak,
the part they
w
see.
zasadzie nie było na
Historians
przykład takich
of
występów jak
the
w przypadku generała Sosabowskiego, że
military history,
próbowano
well,
zatuszować
there was
jakieś
nothing like in the case of General Sosabowski that they
osiągnięcia
tried
czy
to
umniejszać, ale
somehow
też jakiegoś szczególnego
denigrate
tutaj
him
promowania
or
czy zachwytu
try to
też nie ma.
conceal his
Ukazało się
achievements, but there was no
wiele prac na temat samej bitwy pod Monte Cassino, bo wszyscy mają z nią problem.
there
Amerykanie
was
zresztą też.
no
Nie
general
udawało, wykrwawiali
awe.
się tam potwornie.
Well,
Niemcy
Americans
dali
and
łupnia, krótko
British
mówiąc.
have problem with Monte Cassino. They were badly
Natomiast
decimated
jeśli chodzi o
by
taką masową
Germans there.
świadomość, to tak jak
But when we
mówiłem,
speak of that general
momencie, kiedy
awareness,
to
as I
znikło
said,
z
as soon
środków
as
masowego przekazu,
the mass media stopped talking
nie
about
zdążyło
it,
się przebić
it, it by the time it disappeared,
masowej
it had not
świadomości tam na
managed
Zachodzie.
to make it part of the mass
Tutaj te
awareness in
starania
the
nasze,
West. So
one we
our
Włoszech, owszem,
efforts
w
in
części Włoch
Italy,
jest to czytelne.
yes, in parts of Italy, that's
Natomiast tak, żeby
legible. You
masowo
can
odbiorca
see it,
kojarzył w ogóle
but
bitwę o Monte Cassino,
for
to chyba
mass,
nie, może we Włoszech,
um,
ale
for
anglicka
masses to
Może
understand it,
użycie
yes,
tej
perhaps in
bitwy
Italy, but not in
jakiejś
England.
współczesnej
Well, perhaps
popkulturowej
using this
lekturach
battle in some pop
typu gry
cultural products
albo
like
coś w tym
games
rodzaju?
could
Czy znasz takie
perhaps
przykłady
work.
może?
Do you know anything like that? Well,
pojawia się motyw, tylko ja
the
nie pamiętam, czy tam
motive
jest jakiś wątek
is
polski.
present.
Wiem,
I
że z
don't
jednej
remember
beki
whether there is
to się
Polish
jest
theme
strzela
as
się
well,
tam
but there is
FPP,
a
No to pewnie przemycasz
first-person
gatunek.
perspective
tak, bo
shooter,
tam był motyw Monte
and there
Cassino i
was the
jakieś tam
motive of
bieganie po
Monte
ruinach
Cassino. You
wzdłuż
were
Casino, ale mam
running
wrażenie,
uh,
że tam nie było
around
Polaków,
the
tylko raczej z
town.
perspektywy
I
brytyjskiej.
think it was
Wiem o
from the
polskim
British
epizodzie, jeśli
perspective. I
chodzi
know there
o
was a
jakieś grze wykorzystane
Polish episode in a
bitwę pod Falaise.
game where the Battle of Falaise was
Natomiast
used,
tutaj
but
nie wiem, chyba nie.
no, I
Z tym jest,
don't know, and I
słabo,
don't
a też
think
w sumie
so.
dosyć proste, prawda?
No, things
Bo
don't
Oczywiście,
work
że
here,
tak.
but
wystarczy
that's
zapłacić
generally quite easy. It's enough to pay
Ja nawet bym powiedział, ja
the
bym powiedział
artists. I'd even say,
zapłacić to
say,
jedno, ale
well,
trzeba
to pay is one thing, but
dopaść
to
któregoś z
get
twórców i
one of
zainspirować,
those and
opowiedzieć inną
inspire them.
historię.
tell them the story, because very often it happens to me that I start telling a story
Inspirować.
and it's inspiring, yes? Yeah, I start telling people some part of our history and their eyes opened, and they realize, hey, that's so different from what they know.
Można tu ten wątek naszej rozmowy spuentować, że
So if
większość
we
z
could go
tematów
on with that,
historii
like
nam,
most
Polakom,
subject
wydaje się,
themes
że wszyscy
in
to
Polish
znają, bo
history, we
już mamy
Poles
tego
believe
dość,
that
każdy o tym słyszał,
everyone knows
a
it,
po czym okazuje się,
because
że
we're fed up with
przypadku
that.
jakiegoś
Everyone must
szerszego
have heard,
rozpoznawania
but when
tego
we
wątku na świecie, to
look whether the world
jest
has heard of
to,
it,
to jest słabo,
hardly
tak.
ever, hardly anyone knows about it.
Anders jako postać,
Well,
jako
Anders
osoba,
himself, as a person, as a figure,
wyrazista też z wyglądu.
is very
To jest
clear
istotne
also
w
for
kulturze
his looks.
rozpoznawalności.
That's
On się
important
znakomicie
in the
nadawał
world of pop culture.
do promowania.
He would
Ale
make a
zobacz na
perfect
przykład, tak jak mamy
promotion.
postać generała Pattona, prawda?
No, we
Tak,
have
to samo
General
skojarzenie miałem.
Patton.
Totalnie,
My
totalnie
association
rozpoznawalny.
precisely.
Nikogo.
He's
No,
perfectly
ja
well
bym powiedział, że ja nie marzę,
recognized. Now,
żeby
I
świat
wouldn't
zachodu
dream
zrozumiał,
of
ciężko
the
o to,
Western
żeby
world
zrozumiał całą skomplikowaną
understanding the
historię
whole
NP,
complicated
eksodusu
history
Polaków
of
ze
the
Związku
Polish
Sowieckiego, ale
exodus
że
from the
choćby
Soviet
kojarzyli
Union,
takiego
but
kawalerzysty z
that
Władimira,
they
takiego
realized that there was
zakonniczyka
that
jak
swashbuckler
Anders.
and
To było
daredevil called
cudownie.
Anders.
I
That would
myślę,
be
że jakby
fantastic.
trzeba na tym
I believe
pracować.
that we need to work on
To
that
jest rolą
simply,
naszego pokolenia.
and that
No
is the
dobrze, to
role of
teraz
our
z
generation.
drugiej
All right,
strony byśmy
now
zaatakowali temat
let's
ekonomicznie tym
approach this
razem,
subject
no
from
bo
the other side,
formowanie korpusu
economy.
polskiego
Forming
trochę na
the
życzenie
Polish core
brytyjskie.
to
Kto płacił
the
za sprzęt?
British wish,
Dostawaliśmy,
yeah, who paid for the
za kasę
equipment?
rządu
Did we
polskiego?
get
Wszystko
it,
było
or was it the
pożyczone.
money of the
Było wszystko
Polish government?
pożyczone.
Leasing.
Everything
Ale
was
tak,
leased,
darmowy?
yeah,
Leasing, przy czym
leased,
pokryciem z
yes,
tego miały być polskie
but
rezerwy złota.
the
Aha,
Polish gold
czyli,
reserve was
czyli
to
mimo,
pay for
no to
that.
jednak polskie siły, te, które były
So
stworzone
the
w Wielkiej Brytanii,
Polish
no to polski
forces in the
podatek
UK,
musieli mu
well, the
zapłacić,
Polish
tak,
Myśmy za to
za
wszystko
sprzęt.
taxpayer paid for it.
Natomiast
Yes, we
dziś przede
simply paid
wszystkim
for it,
my znamy ostateczny
but we
rezultat.
know the
To
final result
nie
simply
jakby zostało później zdemobilizowane i
that
trafiło z
this
powrotem do
was
magazynu.
not
Zwrócę
uh,
uwagę przykład
in any
czeskiej
way
brygady.
removed
Funkcjonowała
later, and
tak
it
samo.
went to the British
Czesi byli
warehouses.
bardzo
Czech
skromne, ale
brigade
mieli.
was similar.
Polskie
They
tak samo
had
bezużyteczne.
things which were
Czeskie siły zbrojne
quite
na
modest,
czechosłowackie
very
siły
useful.
zbrojne na zachodzie.
They had their
I
Czechoslovak
to wojsko
armed
wróciło
forces,
z
and
czołgami,
that
ze
army
wszystkim,
returned
tak?
to
Także
Czechia with tanks and
Ale
everything
wróciło od razu po wojnie?
immediately after the war.
tak. No,
Yes.
przecież Czechosłowacja to był jedyny
Well,
kraj, który miał szansę
Czechoslovakia
uniknąć
was
tak
the only
naprawdę
country that really
okupacji
had an
sowieckiej. Oni sami
opportunity
zrobili
to avoid the
wybory w
Soviet
Brandpunkt, wolne wybory.
occupation. They made their own free election and they elected communists, and they didn't allow any further free elections.
Dwa lata,
But
no,
the first 2 years, that was there was freedom,
I powrót czeskich
and
tych sił zbrojnych miał miejsce.
there was this
Więc
return of the Czech
polscy
armed forces.
sztabowcy myśleli, no bo to jest
The
jeden z
Polish
częstych
staff
zarzutów.
thought,
Po co
well,
szkolić,
it's
nie
a
wiem,
frequent
lotników, jakichś tam
charge.
bombowców
Why
i tak dalej. No,
train
jednak
bomber
przywódcy wojskowi, polityczni
pilots?
myśleli sobie
Well,
o
the leaders
tego, że no my tą wolność
thought about the
odzyskamy. Trzeba
categories
będzie
of
ten kraj
Poland
odbudowywać,
regaining freedom, and that we would
armię.
have to
I że dobrze
rebuild
mieć.
the
W
country,
związku z tym
notably the
jeździć
Polish
z
army.
najnowocześniejszym sprzętem,
And it could be
wyszkolone
good
na
for that to
najnowocześniejszych
have people
pojazdach,
trained
samolotach, okrętach
on
i tak dalej,
the
tak dalej. No bo jednym
most
z zarzutów
modern
jest taki,
planes,
że to było przeskalowane
men of
za dużo.
war.
Po co
One of the
wydaliśmy tyle,
charges
po
is
co
that
tak
that
wyprawialiśmy, po
was
co
overdone,
formowaliśmy
that
tyle.
was overscaled.
Ja
Why
uważam,
did
że
we
to miało swoje
go that
minusy,
far?
po
It
stronie
had
plusów.
its positive and
Można
negative
zapisać
sides.
właśnie to, że
On the positive
się
side, you
ostatecznie nie udało
could
tego zrealizować.
see,
Ja
well,
widziałem
that
w
finally
Instytucie
failed,
Sikorskiego
but I saw in
Londynie plany,
Sikorski Institute in
analizy
London
finansowe, jak to
are
wykorzystać,
plans,
które już
financial
istniejące jednostki, jakie
analyses
jednostki będą
showing
rozwijane w
which
kraju, jak
units
zostanie ten
would
potencjał
be developed
później
in the country,
wykorzystany,
how
jak
that
wróci
potential would
dowolnej
later be
Polski.
used, and how it is going
No, a
to
drugi powód, dla którego
reach
dobrze istniały polskie
Poland.
siły zbrojne na Zachodzie, no tak jak mówię, to była
Why
ewangelistka polska, tam
it is
mnóstwo
good
ludzi
that
znajdowało
Poland existed?
ratunek
Well,
w
many
bardzo
people were
trudnej
saved.
sytuacji.
Many people were
Jeszcze
saved
tutaj
from
był taki
very
wątek, zdaje
difficult
się,
circumstances. There
była
was
taka
that subject.
powrotu
Speaking of
do
returning
Polski.
to
Był ten
Poland,
wariant z
there
planem
was that
uderzenia
option
nie na
with a
Półwysep
plan
Apeniński,
to
tylko
attack not
na
the
Grecję,
Apennines, but
Bałkany,
Greece
przez
or the
Bałkany.
via Balkans,
Czy
yeah?
tutaj jakby korpus Andersa był tak
Was
samo
the
rozważany
Polish corps
do
also
wykorzystania
considered for
tej
that?
opcji?
To znaczy ten plan został
Well,
zarzucony na
that
tyle
part
wcześnie, no bo już
was
jak drugi
rejected
korpus
fairly
formowano, no to już
early.
tak
When the
naprawdę
second corps was formed, there was an
we
open
Włoszech, natomiast
front
można
in
przypuszczać,
Italy,
jeżeli
but
szło
we
uderzenie przez
can
Bałkany, jeśli by się powiodło,
presume
tak,
that if there
wychodziło
was
takie
an attack
koncepcja,
via
która
Balkans and if it
uważano, że
were
to jest najkrótsza
successful,
droga do Polski. Tak,
this was believed to
tak,
be the
że to tędy
shortest
wróci
route to Poland.
polskie
That
wojsko.
this is the road that the
Natomiast
Polish army will take to return to
tu z wielu
Poland.
powodów
But for many
wybrano
reasons,
Włochy na atak.
Italy was
Dlatego
chosen.
możemy sobie wyobrazić, że
We
jeżeli
can
udało się
imagine
zatrzymać
that if
w sumie jak na w porównaniu z Grecją
comparing to
na
Greece,
jakimś, dogodnym terenie Niemcom,
Mm.
Niemcy znaczy dużo łatwiej było atakować we
it
Włoszech
was
niż w
much
Grecji
easier to attack
i
Germans in
Bałkanach.
Italy
To
than
znaczy
in
ta
the Balkans and
ofensywa
Greece.
aliantów
So that Allied
miała
offensive
małe szanse powodzenia, żeby się przebić do Polski.
didn't have much
I
chance of
wybór
success to
Włoch
break through to
wydawał się
Poland
taki
from there.
trudniejszy, no bo też chodziło o to, żeby
So
wyeliminować
opting for
Włochy
Italy
z tej
was
koalicji.
more
Więc
successful.
tutaj
It was also
ale
about
gdyby,
eliminating
tak, no to
Italy
drugi korpus by
from the
doszedł,
Axis.
może by doszedł, no ale
Perhaps if
Teraz
they
jeszcze
chose
jeden
Greece, then the
tak
second
na
corps
koniec
would go
wątek
and perhaps even reach
strukturalny,
Poland. Now, a
bardzo
structural
taki
subject,
stricte wojskowy, to znaczy drugi
very
korpus to jest taki
military.
termin
The
ogólny.
second corps is this general
Jak
term.
on, jakbyś powiedział, jak był
How
podzielony, ile
would
tam było
you
brygad, ile
say? How was it
dywizji,
divided?
no
How
tak,
many
no,
brigades?
jak
Were
to w
there any
ogóle wyglądało,
divisions?
ile
What
tam
was
było
it
ludzi,
like?
jacyś
How
może
many
bardziej
people were
też
there?
ci dowódcy drugiej linii, no bo
Perhaps there
mówimy
were
tu o
some
Andersie,
more of
i tam
those
jakaś
second
polska
line
no tutaj
popkultura nie zrobiła tak,
commanders. We
ale
know
przecież to są
Anders,
sztabowcy,
but
planiści,
of
prawda? To
course
jest
there
jakby
are
no tak,
people
to jest
doing the
cała grupa
planning.
ludzi.
There's the whole
mamy
staff.
tutaj
We
taką
have
strukturę,
a structure
która
here
była odbiegała
that
od struktur.
diverged from the
Na przykład pierwszą
structures.
dywizję pancerną Maczka trzeba było
Well, the first armored division
była
of
taka
Maciek
sama
had
jak
to be
brytyjskie
adjusted
i
in its structure
amerykańskie,
so
wyboru
that would be
logistycznego
just the
mogły być
same from the
sformowane i tam
logistical point of
współło
view as in the British or US
To było
Army. So to
troszeczkę
have
inaczej,
everything
tutaj można było
standardized, but it was
pozwolić inaczej i inna
it was somewhat
sytuacja logistyczna,
different,
można
but the
było to
logistical
zrobić
situation was
inaczej, więc
somewhat
taka struktura
different.
była
They could establish a somewhat different structure
odmienna od tego.
from
Wyglądało to mniej
what
więcej tak,
is
jak
the
mówię,
British US
na
Army.
etap pod Monte Cassino. Mieliśmy
So, for instance, at Monte Cassino, we had
podstawowo były dwie dywizje, tak?
two divisions.
Trzecia i piąta.
The third and the fifth one of the Carpathian Riflemen
Kresowa, tak?
and the Kresowa.
I do tego
Carpathian
jeszcze
Division
druga
and the
brygada
fifth Kresowa Division and the
pancerna.
second Warsaw Armored
Do
Division.
tego jednostki wszystkie wsparcia, czyli
To that, all
artyleria, ale
support
też
units,
lotnictwo,
artillery,
lotnictwo rozpoznawcze,
Air Force, reconnaissance,
wcześniej
artillery, minesweepers,
całe te wszystkie
air
jednostki
defense
transportowe. W końcu ten
units.
Bear był w jednostce transportowej.
By the way, the
Bardzo
Bear
dużo
was in the transport
takich jednostek, kobiety,
unit.
które pokazywałem
Many
na zdjęciu,
women
to było
whom
zdjęcie,
you
wszyscy
saw
kobiety
on
bardzo
those
często były
pictures,
szoferami.
there were many
Więc
times
całe
the
to
drivers.
zaplecze, kilkadziesiąt
So
tysięcy ludzi, około
it's tens
30
of thousands of people, it's 30 to 35,000 people
wówczas na etapie
who
Monte Cassino,
were at the Monte Cassino, who were
to bardzo skomplikowana struktura. Tak?
were
Czyli
part
armia
of a
polowa,
very complex
saperami.
military
Żeby
structure
zdobyć Monte
with
Cassino,
sappers
jednym z zadań,
and
które
with
trzeba
field
było
hospitals. And one of the
wykonywać w
tasks,
głowie, do dzisiaj jest droga
for instance,
saperów,
to
bardzo drogie ją wybierać.
take Monte Cassino, the sappers had to build a road for the tanks. This road exists until today, by the way.
Dosyć skomplikowana struktura.
Therefore,
Tutaj
the structure was rather complex. General Kopański, General Duch,
oficerowie, dowódcy dywizji, ale
officers
mamy też na
and
przykład
division
dowódcę
commanders,
artylerii,
for
to jest,
instance, artillery
też
commander,
ciekawym tutaj mnie
was
spostrzeżeniem
also an interesting, it's General Odzierzyński, quite an interesting person.
Chciałem zwrócić uwagę jeszcze na jedną rzecz, taki
By the way,
opowiadałem o generale
today I
Sosabowskim i
was
Maćku
mentioning
Kurtykim,
General
którzy też
Sosabowski and
zginęli w
Maciek. They were
1939 roku.
born in 1898.
Generał Anders również i
Anders
generał
was born in
Dzierżyński
1890, and
wszyscy
Dojrzyński
byli z
was
tego
also
samego
born on
rocznika. To takie pokolenie,
1898. So that was the whole
trochę nie
generation
przypadek,
of
tak?
generals. It's
Pokolenie
not a coincidence, by the way.
oficerów, którzy byli
This is a generation of
w 1939
officers who
roku
in
na
1939
średnim bądź niskim szczeblu i
were
w ogóle którzy
mid
się
or high
generalnie
level
sprawdzili w
officers,
przeciwieństwie do
and
pierwszej kadry
they
dowódczej z
did
1939 roku.
really
W
well,
większości
especially
nie dały
compared
rady.
with the top officers from
Więc
1939,
mamy
who in the
tutaj
majority did
to
not
się
manage
zmieniało. To się
well.
zmieniało
So that
później.
was changing, as you can see.
Druga
Later on,
brygada
the second
pancerna
brigade,
została rozwinięta do
armored
dywizji. Została
brigade, was
rozbudowana,
developed
miała
into a
parcie
division.
takie,
So as
że to
the new people were
pozwalało
coming
rozbudować.
in,
Dywizje
they had
były
the possibility to build,
nietypowe w
to
oparciu
develop
na pułku,
new
tylko właśnie teraz
divisions.
brygady,
And
podbrygady.
divisions were two brigades strong, which was
Do
not
tego
typical.
dochodziło wrzucenia
Other
takich jednostek,
divisions
są
were
na
made of
przykład
regiments.
samozwana kompania
Or,
komandosów,
for instance, the
bardzo
commando
znacząca,
unit, a
który
very, very
w pewnym momencie nawet
capable
zostały
unit,
podporządkowane pod
and
osobne jednostki jakieś
at some
włoskie.
point of time they
Więc
were subordinated to
był
some
to
Italian
korpus
units, so
zmotoryzowany, w
that
pełni
a
zmotoryzowany.
corps that was fully
Tak się
motorized.
zastanawiałem, po co pchać
And
piechotę zmotoryzowaną w
they were
wojska.
saying,
Jak
why
naprawdę
should
Alianci
we
nie
put the
mieli nie
motorized
mieli piechoty
units into
niezmotoryzowanej.
the
To był
armies? But they simply
standard.
did not have any non-motorized units.
I
That was a standard to have them motorized.
tutaj też warto powiedzieć, że to była skomplikowana struktura.
So the structure was rather complex, and it was effective. It did well in combat. So we received some know-how from the Allies. Then it was somewhat modified to take into consideration the Polish needs, but still, that was an effective structure. So you can see the corps grew. There were all sorts of ancillary services, educational services. There was the combatant care unit, and so on and so forth. It was as many as 100,000 people, but that was not combat force. I was asking specifically about the combat force. So, as we could say that 60,000, those were as many as 60,000 combat soldiers. But we also need to think about the losses. Losses are the wounded and exhausted by battle, not only killed in action. And again, of course, there were all sorts of people in that corps. But there is always this burden. Once a decision is taken by the commander, those who did not desert are sent into the heat of the battle, and the best are killed. So many wonderful people died in those battles. There were, for instance, officers who, and there were lower rank officers who fought well during the September campaign, but eventually they died in Monte Cassino. But again, that is the so-called gains and losses type of calculation that needs to be taken into consideration. Once we are talking about this military issues, as for the equipment, military kit, that was British military kit primarily. So what were they using? They were using the same things as the British Army was using. So half of their equipment was actually American. The Second Warsaw Brigade was using Shermans, for instance. So, not perhaps the best tank to fight against infantry in the mountains, in the hills. But other type of offensive military kit was doing rather well, and they had an array of British armored vehicles, Darius, and so on and so forth. And the most popular equipment that was the American Jeeps that were used all over the place. So Jeeps were used for logistics, for supplies, for sanitary services. So this Willis was used a lot. So the most characteristic
Ja mogę powiedzieć anegdotę.
things were
przy
used, but I
okazji.
can also talk
W
about
czasach PRL-u
awards.
mój ojciec
My father, in the days of the Polish People's Republic,
sklejał modele.
was
Kiedyś
doing
cenzura
models, and
zatrzymała
one
pakiet, który
censor
dostał z
stopped
Anglii
a
z
parcel
modelem.
that he received from Britain with a
Właśnie,
model
jemu
of.
chodziło, chciał skleić i tam pomalować oznaczenia
He wanted to do a
właśnie z drugiego
model
korpusu.
of a badge of the Polish Second Corps.
I cenzura mu
And the
ostatecznie wydała tą
censorship
paczkę. I po tym,
allowed
jak
him to receive that
pokazał
parcel
zdjęcia
once
z
he
książki,
showed
że również
a picture from a
armia
book
sowiecka
that the Soviet army
rosyjska używała
or the
tego
Russian army was
pojazdu.
using the
I
same
obiecał,
type of
że nie umieści tam
vehicle,
wrogich
and he
emblematów
promised that he would not put
No i
any
nikt się oczywiście nie dotrzymał.
hostile
Uznali, że
emblems
jednak
on
sprawa
it,
nie będzie
and
sprawdzała mu
he
modelów
couldn't
w
restrain
półce.
himself, and he actually put some other
Także ten
emblems
sprzęt
on that model. But so, yes, indeed, they were using equipment of all sorts
No
from
dobra,
different
no
places.
dobra.
Right,
Ja
good.
dziękuję
I would like to
bardzo,
thank
za, Wojtku,
you.
twój czas
I would like to
i
thank you,
tą
Wojtek,
wiedzę,
for your
którą
precious
się,
time and for this knowledge that you have
podzieliłeś,
shared with
za
us.
dzisiejsze
Thank you for
spotkanie.
today's meeting.
Tutaj zgodnie z porządkiem tego
And following
naszego spotkania
the
jeszcze
order of
dwa
agenda
słowa
of our
może
meeting,
od
I think
Weroniki na
Veronica
zakończenie.
would
Także ja
just say
też
a few words
Państwu
to
w swoim
conclude.
imieniu
I
i w
also would
imieniu
like to
Fundacji
thank you on
Janusza
behalf
Kurtyki
of the Janusz
bardzo serdecznie
Kurtyka
dziękuję za
Foundation.
wysłuchanie
Thank you very much for
tej
listening
Q&A, tej serii pytań i
to
odpowiedzi
this
oraz treściwego
lecture and
wykładu
Q&A.
Wojciecha Markerta.
And thank you
I
for
mam nadzieję,
listening
że
to
będzie
the
to
lecture by
inspirujące,
Merkert.
ciekawe,
Wojciech Merkert, I
może
hope that has
poszerzy trochę
inspired
horyzonty,
you
pokaże też takie
and has
wyzwanie,
broadened the
jakie tutaj
horizons.
mimo wszystko z tym takim
This
tematem na pierwszy rzut
shows
oka
that
ubranym,
there is a
można
challenge.
powiedzieć,
One might think that
ale
this is
jednak
a
wiążą
story
się
well
tam jeszcze
known,
dalej
and yet, as you
czekają
can
przed
see,
nami wyzwania na
there are
wiele
so
przyszłość.
many
Dziękuję bardzo.
challenges to face in the
Ja
future.
dziękuję za
And I also would like
spotkanie.
to thank you
Bardzo
very,
dziękuję.
very much.
Ja także bardzo
Also would
dziękuję
like
za
to
udział
thank you
dzisiaj w
very
tym
much for your
spotkaniu.
participation in today's
Zachęcam
meeting.
Państwa
I
do
encourage you
wysłuchania
to
wykładów,
listen to the
które
lectures
znajdują się
which
już
can
na
be
kanale
found on the
YouTube Fundacji
YouTube channel
Janusza
of the Janusz
Kurtyki
Kurtyka
oraz
Foundation and
Blogpress
Blog Press.
w polskiej, angielskiej
We
oraz
have
niemieckiej
recordings
wersji
in the
językowej.
Polish, English, and German
Zapraszam na
languages. So I
kolejne
would like to
wydarzenia
invite you
organizowane w
to
ramach
the next
projektu
event
Ziarna
organized as part of the
Historycznych
Seeds of
Zero
History
Historia
3.0
Pokoleń, które
Relay
odbędzie
of
się w najbliższy
Generations
wtorek,
project, which will take place
19
next
grudnia
Tuesday on the 19th of
2022
December
roku o
at
godzinie 19.
7
Będzie
p.m.
to wykład
It will
profesora
be a lecture
Andrzeja
by Professor
Chwalby
Andrzej Chwalba
zatytułowany
entitled
Generał Foch
General
i jego
Foch and
polsko-polska
his
niepodległość.
contribution to Polish
Dziękuję bardzo
independence.
i
Thank
do
you very
widzenia.
much and goodbye.